Hey everybody, my name's Alex and this is Bento Radio. Now before we get started, just some stuff right off the bat. If you really like the show, be sure to subscribe to it wherever you're getting to it. If that means that you're listening to it on your favorite podcast platform of choice, you can subscribe there and get new episodes every week. The same is true if you're watching me on YouTube. You can subscribe to the channel and make sure you ring the notification bell to find out when new episodes drop. Typically, that means once a week on Thursdays around 7 p.m. But at Eastern time. But in a little while, around from the 20th to the 23rd, I think. That's 4 days. From the 20th to the 23rd of August, I will be at Anime LIC covering it as press. I don't know what the Wi-Fi situation will be in the hotel I'm in, so I can't promise I'll be able to upload something to the podcast channel proper until the following week. Usually what I do is I figure out a way to do something in advance, since these are intentionally usually not timely, and then you get a big podcast at the end if I can't manage to do what I like to call daily updates, which I also do on the podcast sister site, which that site is bento-box.ghost.io. And if you really love the show and what I'm trying to do with the show, be sure to go check that website out. That website again is bento-box.ghost.io. And that link will be available in the description of this podcast as a video or audio. It'll also be in the description of the YouTube channel and the description of the podcast proper, meaning not just the episode, but the overall thing. So it is there for you to click and explore, and there's everything from a questionably working app that you can register for the beta of if you have an iOS device, as well as a bunch of articles and little addendums that I've done add to different episodes. I haven't done that in a while, but that stuff is all there for you if you want more than just this. So definitely go check that out. And on that note, I think we're going to jump right into what we're talking about this week. And that's going to be a big thing. So let me just say what it is, and then we'll get right into it. And that is the entirety of the My Hero Academia anime. So let's check it out.
My Hero Academia follows the journey of a boy born powerless in a world where almost everyone has superhuman abilities known as quirks. The story centers on Izuku Midoriya, a kind-hearted teenager who dreams of becoming a professional hero like his idol, All Might. In this world, heroes are licensed professionals who protect society from villains, disasters, and other threats. Unfortunately, Izuku is one of the rare people born without a quirk, seemingly making his dream impossible. Everything changes when Izuku courageously tries to save a classmate from a villain, despite having no powers. Impressed by his selflessness, All Might reveals that he can pass on his legendary quirk, One for All, to a worthy successor. After months of grueling training, Izuku inherits the power and earns admission to the prestigious UA High School, Japan's premier academy for aspiring heroes. At UA, Izuku joins Class 1A, where he trains alongside talented classmates with unique quirks. Together, they learn combat, rescue techniques, teamwork, and the responsibilities that come with being heroes. However, their education is repeatedly interrupted by increasingly dangerous attacks from criminal organizations, most notably the League of Villains, led by the mysterious Tomura Shigaraki. As the series progresses, the conflict grows beyond a simple battle between heroes and villains. Ancient secrets surrounding One for All and its dark counterpart, All for One, come to light, revealing a generations-long struggle that threatens the future of hero society itself. Izuku must learn to master his overwhelming power while confronting difficult questions about justice, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be a hero.
With the plot synopsis out of the way, I want to clarify here, I'm not covering any of the movies because I don't have an infinite amount of time, and I just shotgunned, literally I finished within minutes of recording this, I just shotgunned 8 seasons of anime and 8 seasons of shonen battle anime, which I don't know how much you do or don't like shonen battle anime, but 8 seasons straight to the eyeballs is a lot. And I certainly felt it, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I want to go back to what my initial thoughts on My Hero were, and if you haven't been following the podcast for a while, you probably don't know this, but I have an expertise in being different. And to me, this show, the whole way through, was an exploration of what difference means in a world where everyone is a little different, but not so different that it brushes up against social mores and all this other stuff. One of the geniuses of modern superhero stuff. And I think part of what's interesting about My Hero Academia is it straddles the two kinds of Shonen Jump anime there are. What I mean there is that it straddles old world, deeply hopeful, wish fulfillment shonen of Naruto, Dragon Ball Z, Yu-Gi-Oh! Even, that kind of Bleach to a certain extent. Bleach is still here with us. One Piece even. Those shonen shows have this very hopeful hero mentality. And then that's where My Hero started. And what it smashed into was a reality that is much different than it is. Than old world shonen is. I talked about this with my episode on Gachikuda, is that Shonen has changed, Shonen Jump output, or Shonen in general as a genre has changed as the world has changed. You don't have heroes like Goku or even Naruto anymore because you can't. If that makes it. You can, and it's totally a thing you can go after, but it's not, it doesn't reflect as much and it doesn't deal with as much as a character like Rudo does. Or a character like Kafka. Kafka is a great example, especially for people my age. I'm in my mid-30s. Just like Kafka. It doesn't reflect a world that nothing feels possible or is possible. Those aren't really the issues. It doesn't reflect a world that the viewer is living in. One of the things you get to watch pretty starkly in shotgunning this much of a show, you get to see really what it's trying to do with the storytelling and things that the show is trying to say on a larger scale are all amplified because you're not waiting week to week, you're not pausing in between seasons for a year or for close to a year sometimes, or a month or whatever it is. You get to see the totality of what the show is trying to say. And in My Hero Academia, the main storyline is Izuku Midoriya, the current ninth wielder of One for All, trying to beat this age-old thing that is All for One, and that evil. But what happens around that main storyline is also all tangled up with it, because it's about the My Hero universe that it is envisioned, to a fault, by the way, is envisioned as being a universe that is fully fleshed out and has real problems. And in my first watch through, because I didn't make it through the entire series when it was originally airing, which isn't that long ago, when stumbling points came up, I didn't push past them because I had other stuff I was watching, but also it felt the stumbling blocks in the show hit you so hard because the show's clearly trying to do a ton with itself. And when it hits its own popularity, it starts to have a problem. And you get things like the school festival arc, which does set up Gentle Criminal, and he factors into the final season in a key way, because everybody does. But that extreme tone shift of that fourth season is so momentum-stopping. Not momentum slow to a stop, but momentum cram into the wall of just, and now we're doing a school festival situation. And after the overhaul arc with Eri and all that stuff, it's just, you're so... That's the third season of My Hero. And I forget what season it is. I think it might be the fifth season where it's briefly My Villain Academia. Actually, it might be the sixth. Those two seasons stand out to me in really extraordinary ways. They come back in the final season, but because they are so about the real thing that I think Horikoshi is poking at these different moments in the show. Horikoshi pokes at sheer xenophobia that can exist from people who just look different than you. And what So what Horikoshi does with xenophobia towards heteromorphs in the show is really smart, because this man must be an incredible fan of the X-Men. I can only imagine. But he does what the X-Men do, in that he makes it so there's almost a point to people being scared of heteromorphs, because everybody has superpowers, and heteromorphs very often just have superpowers that make them more like whatever they look like. Tentacruel and Hannah Voice, the two characters, I forget their names, they're the students' names, but those are hero names. They are a weird exception to that situation, because they have powers in addition to being what the show calls heteromorphs, which are people who've received quirks that make them physically different than a human. This is a great part of the X-Men comics, pretty later on in the total run of X-Men, where the X-Men rescue a mutant. And it's not, this guy doesn't look normal. This guy has 3 eyes and has lizard skin. They call him ugly, straight up. And the point of showing that in that moment is to show you that the X-Men are the lucky mutants. They're the ones who got superpowers. And later on in the show, they don't even necessarily get that lucky, because lots of them get cancer. Like, sometimes your secondary mutation is better superpowers, sometimes it's just cancer. That's the way the show works. The way that super mutations in that comic series work. But very often, people born mutants aren't born with extraordinary powers, they just look different. Their bodies have just mutated in such a way that they might have 3 eyes and lizard skin, and lizard scales on their skin. We see this in actual human beings. I am among the last generation to get goosebumps. My age of millennials, people after us don't get goosebumps as often, if at all. That's a mutation, because goosebumps were a thing that were needed as a fear response, and the need has dissipated over time to such an extent that people very often younger than me don't get goosebumps. They don't experience that in their body. But the thing that X-Men does, and the thing that My Hero does, it makes the difference so palpable that it is something that could be afraid of. And then the thing that both of them also do is they keep running with that. And I don't think it's so clear to me that My Hero, it's so clear to anyone with eyeballs and any sense of media literacy, even the slightest bit, that My Hero does not exist without superhero comics, like American comics, and almost specifically X-Men. Because the world setting is so one-to-one, except instead of where more and more mutants are being born to normal families, they make it a abnormal thing if you don't have powers. And the combination of the world working the way it does, and the combination of what Horikoshi decides to do with the main characters, his very clear understanding and deployment of disability as a trope, because he does use it, and I'll talk about that in a second. He created a world that, on the surface, to someone who doesn't have a deeper understanding of the world, is a great place. But the thing that the show tells you is that with the emergence of quirks came superheroes, and the age of heroes began. What it's not telling you there is that with the emergence of quirks also came people who do bad things enough where heroes were necessary. And throughout much of the run of the show takes a second. Starting with my favorite episode that I brought up on the podcast, even after it's been a video podcast a lot of times, which is the episode all about Twice. Kind of starting with that, the show starts to get way less one-sided. And this is part of the reason why I like Season 3 a lot, is because Season 3, you see the old world criminality that's reaching into the new one, and the way that Kiseki, the name for the villain, Overhaul rather, I should just call him Overhaul. You see his relationship with quirks, and the fact that he wants to eliminate them from the world. And he said it with such fervor and such kind of determination. And up until that point, you haven't really seen that kind. You haven't seen that kind of specific crazy. You also haven't seen cracks in society aren't as apparent. What you're presented with is a lot of characters who are bad guys, yes, but they're twisted, and the camera keeps them kind of twisted and at a distance as if they are comic book villains. But over time, you spend serious time with the villains, and I'm gonna have to change my battery, damn it. You spend serious time with the villains, and you get to know them. You get to know, in many cases, why they became the way they are. And you see in every case that there were outside forces that let this happen. My favorite example will always be Toga. I have a figure of Toga sitting actually next to my TV at this point. He used to be sitting next to my monitor, but I moved it. In Toga's case, they sent her to, I'm assuming, some sort of abusive therapy. Her parents thought she was a monster. They were so scared of how, the best word, violently different Toga was from anyone else, that they didn't think, this is a child. If we don't sit here and say, why are you killing birds? Why are you drinking blood? If they didn't sit there and figure out what the heck quirk they had, then they wouldn't be able to help her, and they were so consumed by fear and so put off by this creepy child who had these creepy urges. If her parents had sat her down and talked to her and gone to the right kind of medical and psychological treatment, there's a real chance Toga wouldn't be the nightmare she becomes in the first part of the show. Actually, right up until the very last episodes in the show. But the show is, when I hadn't seen the final season, I think the final season is actually really important for this. I hadn't seen the final season. I used to think the show wasn't following through enough on the threads it starts. It wasn't following through on the deeply abusive environments that could exist in a society that fixed the top layer but didn't go down to the bottom layer and deal with it. And you see that in Nana Shimura's kind of life. You see the fact that her abandoning her son created an opening to be manipulated all the way up till Shigaraki. And you see by the end of the show what that leads to, and the fact that All For One had the space to do that because there was no safety net. And the reason All For One existed at all is that there was no safety net. There was no... They do the saying with All For One in that they show you that he was evil from birth, that he was just born evil. But there's this... Look, they show his mother, and they show his mother's quirk, and the fact that he stole his mother's quirk as an infant and killed her, I'm assuming. But they showed his mother when she was still pregnant with him, and how at end she was. How unwilling anyone was to push past the barrier of like, oh, your quirk's hurting you. We should get you, and you're pregnant, we should get you to a hospital. I have a frustration with people, because I don't think that people see a big and wide enough angle of what happens in the world. I don't think that people see... Well, I think it's easy for people not to see that everything's connected to everything else. I think it's really hard to make... Or I don't even need to say I think. It is really hard to make something that reflects that. I think in the construction of... Over time, I've read some stuff, particularly about Endeavor and Endeavor dying, that Horikoshi has changed his mind as he's been writing My Hero over the years. But I think that he does a pretty good job by the end of it of showing that the world was broken enough to produce the amount of pain and suffering that leads to a lot of people who would do harm to others, villains, as the show calls criminals. But it's also, at the same time, that same world that My Hero takes place in has created an entire offshoot of people idolizing heroes and not being sure why, but demonizing, not even villains, but people they perceive as villains, and being so sure of why, but I bet if you asked them, they wouldn't be able to articulate it. They just wouldn't be able to. The character Shinzo is a perfect example. He has a quirk that very much evil-coded. The way you can think about this is part of the reason why people love Piccolo as a Dragon Ball Z character is because he was the bad guy in original Dragon Ball. And so all of his super moves are moves that bad guys do. He shoots lasers out of his mouth. Like, the guy, that's a really smart use of, oh, this is what you would do if you were a bad guy. And they also do it a lot with Vegeta. Vegeta's attacks are very much his attacks. And he's a good guy, but he's not necessarily a nice guy kind of thing. But in this show, they set the world up so there's no room for variegation. You can't, it's very hard for this show's world to allow for a character twice, for example, or even Toga, to be understood as somebody who's had trouble in their life, somebody who is looking for a place to be accepted, because both Toga and Twice, I can't pronounce his name well, Bibakawara, I think is his real name, are both so ostracized from the outside world, and so they feel so penned in by style structure of Japan, but also probably the wider world, that they don't have a place to be. And so they end up, in hilariously the same way as the Yakuza, which in this world timeline, the Yakuza, with the exception of very small instances, are largely gone. Or they're just like, they were, the idea of criminal organizations were kind of quashed with the arrival of everybody has superpowers now. And at that point in the show, when they start introducing that, and you start to see that the world, it wasn't destiny that Toga became a nightmare. It wasn't destiny that Twice became a supervillain. It was a repeated failing of the world around them. By the end, everybody, like, Uraraka sees in Toga, oh, the world let you down. The world failed you. It's very clear that the world failed, well, what's his name? Disintegration Hands. He's the main bad guy, fuck. But it's very clear that all of the characters you meet as villains in this show, with the exception of a few side character villains, were failed on such a, what if you're not paying attention, feels like such a cosmic level, is crazy. So, in the case of Tomura Shigaraki, the guy who, I couldn't remember his name earlier. In the case of Tomura Shigaraki, yes, by the way, spoiler, obviously, for all of My Hero, but yes, One for All did guide this kid into being and then being a nightmare. But there are moments when the world around Shigaraki could have reached out and could have been like, hey, you're a scared kid, you're alone, let's try to get you somewhere where that's not true. And because everybody was so, not just so trusting that everything would be taken care of by heroes, but also so avoidant of the deep darkness of life, that when a slightly lovely woman, probably in her 40s in the flashback, but you see her later and she's like an old lady. You see her in present day and she's an old lady. When an old lady sees a kid wandering helpless, covered in blood, and scared out of his wits, and deeply sad and deeply, clearly traumatized, walking through the streets by himself, with no shoes on, your first question should be, hey, do you know where your parents are? Let's get you to a police box. We'll figure this out. We'll put out a bulletin. And you at least try to get them to, if you can't help, you should at least try to get them to a place that can. And not even that happened. So yes, One for All manipulated an entire bloodline to make basically a new body for himself, ultimately. But the rest of the world also didn't step in and be like, oh, there's something wrong there. Let's fix it. And as the show gets darker and as the world gets less safe, the show does the Avatar thing of being like, oh, you have to kill the big bad. Sometimes that's just how you have to do it. Sometimes that's how you save that person, is you kill them. And that is what happens in the end, but it's also not what Midoriya wants. I think this is probably a really important thing, is Midoriya in this show starts out disabled. And what I mean there is he doesn't have a quirk. There are other characters throughout the show who don't have quirks, and you see their paths in life, and it's interesting. But by having him start on his back foot meaningfully with every other character, including anybody with any kind of quirk. Even his mother has a quirk, although I don't think you ever see her use it in front of her son on screen except for once, when she purely does it to demonstrate. So I find that really interesting. So much of what happened to Aoyama, who didn't have a quirk, and was manipulated by All for One. What happened to Shigaraki, who had his quirk taken at birth, and All for One found a quirk similar to Overhaul, and removed the other half of it, and gave the destruction part to Tomura Shigaraki. What happened to him? What happened to Toga? What happened to however Twice got screwed up? What happened to Twice? All of these things. What happened to Spinner? Which is also what happened to Toji, the Tentacool, I think his name is, but Tentacruel is actually the name because Tentacool is a Pokemon, and that would be IP infringement. What happened to all of these characters could have very easily happened to Midoriya, and actually did. A thing that, for everybody, that I don't hear enough people say is that Himiko Midoriya, Deku's mom's response to him not having a quirk is not, and I say this as a disabled person who grew up with a single mother, which is essentially what Inko is. You never see Deku's dad on screen, ever. When Inko's approached with, your kid is essentially disabled, she doesn't support him anyway, at first. The first thing out of her when she finds out that Deku doesn't have a path to being like his idols, the superheroes that every kid is seeing on TV, and every kid, including his best friends, are absolutely have a path at getting to. For somebody like his best friend and rival and bully, Bakugo, has a definitive path to getting to. She doesn't say, you can still be a hero, we'll figure this out together. She says, you have to find a new dream. And everyone says that to him, even All Might, until he reminds them what it actually means to do that, what it actually means to be heroic, what it means, well, not just what it means to be heroic, but what it means to be heroic in ways that no one else is willing to, including All Might, because everyone has this. I'm not saying that Deku has this long-tail view of, that's at least stated in the show by the character, so it almost certainly doesn't exist. He has this long-tail view of the world and life, but everyone in the show is so present and so focused, they miss, once again, the wider picture. They're so busy stopping the disaster that they don't stop and figure out why the disaster happened in the first place. And so much of the final battle of this show is current generation of heroes and people and young people dealing with the sins of who came before them. The fact that Toga's parents gave up on a little girl. The fact that there were no mental health services that seemingly would help Bobagawara, aka Twice. The fact that Spinner was basically forced to be a shut-in. And the big hint at this in the first part of the show is it's a Stain arc where Stain is a psychopath, obviously. But Stain is telling you, there's something wrong here. There's something messed up. And while he's obviously, once again, a psychopath and crazy and evil as hell, he's got religious fanaticism to him about hero work and being a hero. And actually, you don't see his origin story until the prequel comes out, which is, well, I forget what it's called. It's the one that takes place in earlier. And actually, I want to talk about that for a second. In that show, because it came after Horikoshi was already most of the way down the road for My Hero, and My Hero Vigilantes comes, it can pull on the threads, and I'm sure there was people going back and forth, there was some back and forth communication there of where this aspect of the show coming from. If you watch My Hero Vigilantes, you see a less entrenched version of the problems that are in society by the time you get to My Hero Academia. And what this show does with the ending episodes of the show is it says we've taken this current generation of young people and we've shown them that it's messed up out there. It's bad. Not only is it bad, but it's the kind of bad you don't want to think about or stare at. And sure enough, in the last episode of the show proper, they did another episode called More, which is adapting the very last chapter of Horikoshi's manga, where, like, Deku and Uraraka finally have some version of a confession at each other, even if it isn't as satisfying as you want it to be. In the episode before that, in the second to last episode, and essentially episode, I think it's 11, maybe it's 12, and the last one is 13, but in episode 12, I'm going to call it, you see where all the heroes go, and you see how much community work people are doing. Toji and Koda are constantly doing summits for for heteromorphs. Sue and Uraraka are going into school and doing much more hands-on work counseling and being like, hey, what's your power? And when somebody I want to tell you, they're like, I promise I won't freak out. I don't care what it is. They have the experience and the lived experience, and they know the way the world has transpired around them. They understand over time, I'm sure, that Toga doesn't exist without a world to make her that way. Neither do any of the people who, in the League of Villains, who ultimately almost destroyed the world. And they're trying to correct for it. I think that's probably, obviously the wish fulfillment thing is in a young boy getting superpowers and only losing them after vanquishing ultimate evil and learning that he doesn't need them. And the show gives you that back by making Deku like Iron Might 2, by giving Deku an Iron Man suit like All Might had, so he could be a hero again. He didn't have to give up his dreams. But it also fulfills what we want out of life, especially now, because so often we're seeing results of the cracks around us, and we're not seeing people fix it. There's a great movie called, you've probably heard of, it starred Tom Hanks, called Charlie Wilson's War. It's about dealing with the Middle East, and then all of a sudden, at the end of the movie, Tom Hanks gives a speech, and he's like, and we screwed up, because we didn't go back in and build a better world for them afterwards. We just left them there. We told them to fight, screw up their country, and then we left it screwed up for decades. And you have all kinds of terrible results of that. Because you left this void there. And I think the awesomeness of the show is it gives you episodes after the big finale to be like, no, this is what you do. This is what you do in the interim. Just try and make sure that if something goes horribly wrong again and Nightmare Bad Guy shows up, at least you know it wasn't the stuff that happened to the last set of Nightmare Bad Guys. At least you know the support system for a kid who was abused until he accidentally disintegrated his family, which is a real thing that can happen in My Hero universe. At least you know there's somebody with a doubling quirk and they drive themselves insane. You have train people to be like, hey, everything will be okay. You're still alive. Like them through that thing. Same with Toga. Same with everybody with the exception of One For All. The genius of One For All as a character is flashback to his birth. And they're like, no, this kid was evil, but he was also born in a world where that evil could never be steered away from. Many people in a cast of the show worry about Bakugo because he's until a certain point in the show he's so increasingly violent and increasingly about it, especially towards because he's having an internal crisis. And what so much of this show is actually little asides with the teachers of we should all start looking after Bakugo. Is there something happening there? We need to help him get through it and maybe keep both him and Midoriya alive in the process. And it's just it's a whole, and this is probably where I'm going to leave it because I've been rambling for a while now. But the whole, of it is, it sees a much bigger picture, and probably what convinced me to do this in the back of my head is probably Vigilantes, because in Vigilantes, that are very clearly, causes in My Hero Academia proper, in Vigilantes, they're much closer to the surface. It can sound weird. Think about the weird eel boy man, Vigilantes, who becomes, the big eel monster a lot. Because, you see a fantastic example of, deep xenophobia around heteromorphs. It's this guy who everybody thinks is gross because he is gross, but that's not his fault. He was born like this. He doesn't have control over it. It's not a thing that he can control. And so when Pop Step shows him any amount of affection, he latches onto it so maniacally that, he becomes exploitable. That makes total sense. That's a 1 + 1 = 2 every time. Unless you are, you have a unique thing in you of having this really unshakable will that it's somebody else's problem with you, not your problem with you. But that can even be beaten out of people. And I think that's important. But I also think it's important that the show with insane violence, is so about meeting who you perceive as a bad guy, as a villain, on even playing field, and not being the first attempt. Because I feel like everybody took the wrong lesson from life somehow. In that we all figured that, bullies are bad because bullies bully the weak. But what if we pointed that same energy at people we perceive to be bad people who are strong enough to be bad people? But your perception might not be right. Bullying is still bullying. That is the thing about bullying that all the PSAs from back in the day got right. Is bullying is a vicious cycle. Bullied people become bullies. What does that mean that we're doing to people who I'm talking about criminals. I'm not talking about any of this other level truly nightmare, Muammar Gaddafi nightmare shit. They should be dealt with by laws and whatever. But I am talking about people who are lost somehow. People who are so frustrated with the system that they've been on a target somehow. Bullying them won't make it better, it will make it worse. It may get them pointed away from you, but it will point them towards someone else. And it'll be worse for that next person. And there's become this conviction with what's right and just, and a willingness to ignore the way you got there for the achievement of whatever you perceive to be right. And I don't think that's the balance right of, both of those, yes, that person is wrong, but how did they get that way, and how can we respond to this in a way that causes minimal damage to us, everyone around us, and the person who's wrong. I've made a decision lately that I think if you have a disagreement with somebody, if you have a real, good faith disagreement or argument you want to take to somebody, I don't think you should do it in public. Because I think people are so rigged to go one way or another in anyone's favor that it's very easy to win over a crowd. A great quote from Men in Black is, a person is smart. People are dumb, panicky animals, and you know it. And I think that's true. I think the social effects of bullying on people around other people, on people around you, are still very true. The mob mentality takes over, and people start to dogpile the person who's the intended target. And that person may back down, that person may learn their lesson, but that person still walks away wounded. And having learned the lesson that they can do that to somebody else for some other reason. And I think so much about what this show is trying to say in the shonen form is we should be trying to correct the ills of the world without assuming that the other person is a bad person because they're wrong about something. And assuming that the other person's dreams you perceive as being evil or bad don't come from a place that they want to be there. And also we should recognize when all of the stuff we fear to be true about bad people is real. And we should learn to identify that and handle that in a very specific way that is different and separate from, this is a person who is damaged, who was sent along this path it's not too late to correct that with them, but we should also be working to correct everything along the way that led up to this. Like that, and you see the old lady that didn't help Tomura when he was a kid and it just disintegrated his entire life. She says that she tried to help this little girl and let this little girl help, and she's like, I'm still so sorry about not helping that kid back then. I hope he was okay. And that's awful. It's an awful thing to feel. It's just a message that I can glean through this. We should deal with the ills of the world and then work to make sure that those ills can't come back. Does that make any sense? You can apply that to all kinds of modern day things. But there's usually a reason why people decide to do things or think a certain way. And if you meet them as another person, if you just say, look, you're a human being, I'm a human being, why do you think this? What makes you think this? What got you here? That immediate acceptance of, this is how we're similar, let's move on to the next thing, brings down the temperature and allows people to be less afraid of what comes next. I know a lot of people listen to this. I know for a fact a lot of people listen to this live, but no. It can't be. Responding to bad with bad can't be the solution. And responding to pain with the infliction of pain can't be the solution. In order for the big, not just bullying cycle, but like big cycle of just bad stuff happening to stop, you have to stop it. You have to make an effort to be like, I'm not going to pick this fight. And I know that feels really hard to do. But if you want to fix things, then you gotta do it. You have to meet people in a very different way than what traditional hero narratives about bad villains, good superheroes tend to support. And what I think is really interesting is as the world has gotten darker and more complicated, My Hero Academia clearly grew into that, but also it didn't let go of the idea of, like, no, but we can't keep doing this. The baseline principle of this is just wrong. And the baseline principle of so much violence in the world is just wrong. It just shouldn't happen. But people are so tangled up in all of it, they can't find their way out. And then you do, in the way that All for One is a bad actor. You have some bad actors who are using that whole cycle to try and maintain some kind of power, privilege, whatever it is. And like I said, if we find people who match that description, we should do what we can to just move them off the board. Not necessarily assassinate world leaders or any of that bullshit, but get them out of the way so they can spew what they want, but it won't reach the levels it's currently reaching. A great example, I'll take an example of this show from the final season of the show, and then I'll probably leave it. But in the throes of the heteromorph trying to go rescue Kurogiri, the warp no move guy, the heteromorphs are pointed at that problem. And there's this guy who's acting like this zealot, preaching, crazy man who just, he never fights. All he does is just spur people on to do the fighting and to destroy the world. And Shoji and Koda, both as heteromorphs, just full on get the entire place to stop because they're like, are you gonna keep doing this? Are you gonna perpetuate this cycle of violence and anger and hatred? Because it won't stop if you don't stop it, if we don't just drop it dead right now. And the guy keeps preaching from the rooftop. Eventually Koda sends birds up there. He's like, oh, you're the problem. We need to get rid of your influence because he's essentially leading a bullying campaign against the world. And the mob mentality of all the other heteromorphs in those episodes are driving that forward and giving his persuasions power and effect. Same way that I thought that Attack on Titan is about the badness of mass violence, I think that this show is, to an extent, about the consequences and the realization of needing to deal with the untreated problems and the fact that people don't exhibit kindness to strangers without a reason. The fact that there is no system for dealing with people who have bouts of being mentally unwell. That could just be bouts, don't have to be an entire life. Could just be like, oh, there's people here to help you, there's people here to talk to, there's all of these tools that are explicitly there to help you not to be predatory in another way, because that's also a problem in reality. But I think that's what My Hero's, message is. Broad message, if there is one. So, that's what I think about the entire show. So, I'm going to leave it here.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast, and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.